What I want to focus in on is the idea that the schooling system, as it exists today, was established by a certain kind of revolutionary that was counter working class revolution. They were countering working class revolution. It comes from the early 20th century. And the strategy was to get us to see ourselves as extremely different from one another, especially people who are in a pretty similar class position. And that was important at the time because the Carnegies and the Rockefellers, who were the richest people in the world at the time, did not like the looks of working class rebellion. They didn't like unions. They didn't like strikes. They definitely didn't like the looks of what was going on in Russia in 1905. Progressivism, as a specific approach that gets adopted by Democrats, but also to a large extent by Republicans, is an ideology that is meant to respond to the working class crises of the time, to make it so that working class people can't organize. This is all in Weapons of Mass Destruction by John Taylor Gatto. And I want to read a couple of quotes that I think are very important for that. But first, I want to say where that's going. I want to say that in that experience where you are being not sex segregated from your supposed peers, but you're actually being interned with them, like inmates in a prison, in a giant facility where you're being treated like cattle, what you develop, and this was obvious to people who lived 150 years before the development of the schooling system. It was obvious to people like Fichte and Spinoza, theorists of education, also philosophers and scientists. It was obvious to them that a way to undermine working class organizing against people who just want to use you for labor power, who just want to use us for labor power, is to develop a kind of schooling system where you tell people it's all about the education, but in reality, what we're teaching you is that you have to compete for a sense of identity. You have to compete for a sense of identity, and you have to defend yourself at all costs from your direct peers, from whom you get no real space, from whom you don't get any real time alone, except for when you're back at the house, exhausted, right? And even then, when you're back at the house, you're supposed to spend all your free time preoccupying your mind with homework, not so that you can learn the subject matter so much as to impress a teacher. Now, this is all arguable, and people have argued with me about it. And it's because people like to argue about it that I like to come equipped with quotes, because I think it's important that we as working class kids here know what our history is and where these institutions come from. Now, working class people for hundreds of years fought for public universal education. We fought for that. Our parents' parents fought for that. But at the point that the richest, most powerful people in the world said, let's give it to them, it was a bait and switch. And they were talking about it in conspiratorial tones openly. It was not a secret. And so I will quote the father of progressivism, Woodrow Wilson, who became president of the United States a few years after this quote. But in 1909, when he was president of Princeton University, he said to the New York City School Teachers Association, "We want one class of persons to have a liberal education." And by that, he doesn't mean like liberal, like progressive. He means like liberal arts. You know, you'll play musical instruments and learn lots of languages and study philosophy and, stuff like that. He said, we want one class of persons to have a liberal education, and we want another class of persons, a very much larger class, of necessity in every society, to forego the privileges of a liberal education. Forego means like, you don't get it. You don't get to have those privileges. And instead fit themselves to perform specific manual tasks. Now, Woodrow Wilson was a homie. Not like to us. He wasn't our homie, but he was like the homie for the Rockefellers and the Carnegies. Okay. The most powerful people in world history, it could be argued. Oil, right? Oil tycoons in the case of the Rockefellers, right? Antitrust laws were invented to break up the monopoly that they had on oil. That's how powerful and wealthy they were, right? I forget what the Carnegies were doing, but it was a big deal. Okay. These were industrial titans, as we say. They were much more rich and much more powerful than Elon Musk today. Even though if you look at the numbers that Bezos or Musk makes, it looks like they make a lot more money. But because there's so many more billionaires in the field, it's relatively not as powerful because the Carnegies and Rockefellers were billionaires at a time when a billion went a lot further and there were fewer other billionaires. And so today there's over 1,000 billionaires. We just know the names of a few of them. And it's usually people like Musk and Bezos. So what I'm trying to say is the Rockefellers were powerful and they were homies with Woodrow Wilson. And you want to hear what their occasional letter number 1 was for their general education board? Well, the quote that matters the most is right here. In our dreams, people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. The present educational conventions of intellectual and moral education fade from our minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive folk. We shall not try to make these people, or any of their children, into philosophers, or men of learning, or men of science. We have not to raise up from among them authors, educators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we have an ample supply. The task we set before ourselves is very simple. We will organize children and teach them to do in a perfect way the things their fathers and mothers are doing in an imperfect way. To summarize Woodrow Wilson's quote as well as the Rockefeller quote, because they are using some antiquated language, they're simply saying this. We want 2 classes of people. One to be a very, very, very small class of very privileged people who are born into wealth, and they get to study whatever they want, and everybody else is supposed to study something to make them a good worker. End of story. Full stop. But making it a divisive regime, making it so that we all developed hyper niche, competitive, defensive habituses that make it impossible to organize large scale structural change was not an accident. It's not what's being taught on the syllabus. In critical pedagogy, it's called the invisible syllabus, right? The invisible syllabus is the actual structure of the school itself. The idea that you should spend 1/3 of your life forcing yourself to focus on what authority figures arbitrarily tell you is interesting to you. 1/3 of your life. What happens during the other third of your life? You're sleeping. What about the other third of your life? Well, I mean, it would be great if it was with friends and family, but for the most part, it's TV and video games. And TV and video games have been mostly replaced by smartphone games and TikTok. And let's be honest, if you're like me, then you're on Netflix at the exact same time that you're on your phone. Come on. Just like ADHD max it out. Who cares? Just max ADHD. Why not? Why not? Because it feels like freedom. And I said this at the beginning of the semester, right? It feels like freedom